Welcome back. Uganda's President Yoweri Museveni on Thursday criticized the World Bank's decision to suspend new funding in response to a harsh anti-LGBTQ law. The World Bank has released a statement that says despite the latest decision, it is committed to helping all Ugandans without exception escape poverty and have access to vital services and improve their lives. Now, for more on this, we are joined by Dr. Jason Musyoka, a development economist and associate researcher from the University of Pretoria. Doctor, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Now, Doctor, in reacting to the stance of the World Bank, President Museveni said that Uganda will not be coerced into abandoning their culture, their principles and sovereignty in order for them to be given money. What's your take on that stance?
So I think that there is a broad context to what is going on in Uganda. There is an increasing voice in the continent, particularly pushing back. And this has a lot to do, by the way, with the fact that there is an alternative now to the Western supply of resources. And this is, of course, China and the BRICS and so on. So we've seen increasing voices, whether from Uganda or from Rwanda or from Kenya. So Uganda is not the only country that is really kind of having some bold resistance to some of these, issues that they consider as localized. So that's the first point to mention. But I think the third part, is that there is a very long history between Uganda since really the current regime started in 1986 with the World Bank and the US. The World Bank has been very consequential as far as development in that country is concerned, running all the way, and there are significant improvements around a range of indicators, from macro to micro, and improvement of that country's development. So it's unfortunate that we are now dealing with the tensions that might affect some form of funding to these development programs.
And with that investment that has been made by the World Bank in terms of infrastructure over the years, how much is it currently making into Uganda, and what is that money utilized for?
So the World Bank, what it really does is that it draws out a criteria. There are countries that are part of what they call International Development Association, which is a wing of the World Bank that really funds poor countries. Their threshold at the moment is about 1,315 US GNI, gross national income. And if your country has lesser than that per year, then you are eligible for free assistance. And you don't really have to pay interest on credit that is given. And Uganda falls within that threshold, considering that their GNI is just under 1,000. And that's why Uganda has been very consequential. It was still the first country, if you recall, that was really forgiven of its debt when the debt clearance issues were being discussed. So the investment at the moment, I think we are looking at the current funding, which is upwards of $300 million US dollars. But if you go back to history, going all the way, as I said, from 1986, the funding is very broad because there's a private sector funding where the World Bank, IMF, and other international institutions, they provide credit up to 15% of all the credit that is utilized in the private sector. The healthcare industry in Uganda is funded, 35% is funded by these organizations, including the World Bank. So the funding is massive. Education, the same thing, water and sanitation. So it's huge. It's segmented into sectors, but it's a huge operation that World Bank really runs in Uganda.
Most certainly it is. And I mean, if you're mentioning healthcare, water and sanitation, as well as education, it surely means that the impact will hit hardest on the people at the very bottom in Uganda. How severe is this impact going to be?
The impact on health could be concerning, partly because particularly the HIV program. The country was among the first that achieved the Millennium Development Goals 2015. That's thanks to the World Bank funding and reducing the HIV infection rate. Education enrollment also shot up from upwards of 60 to about 92% now, the net enrollment rate on primary school. So if they are going to retreat from funding, you're going to see some rollback. But I also need to say, is that you have what the World Bank really said is that they are not going to defund current programs. They're going to withhold any new funding until, and they put this clause in their statement, they have evidence that there are no people who are being discriminated in terms of these services that they support as far as sexuality and gender is concerned. So there is still a caution, but I think that the President Museveni reacted perhaps politically and pushed back. We are yet to see how that is going to unfold, but the current operations will still continue according to the World Bank.
And what precedents do you then believe the World Bank has set with this? Will we possibly see other funders also pulling back some of their new funding?
Potentially. The World Bank, remember that when you look at the voting segmentation of the World Bank, about 17% is voted by the U.S. itself. As we speak now, the U.S. is pushing for new legislation to try and also cut funding on Uganda. And there was also, just a few days before Uganda, there was Niger with a coup there. And World Bank, again, retreated from providing any further funding alongside others. Every time that the World Bank ceases from funding or cuts funding, it really is the United States, and then the G7 countries. G7 countries contribute 45% of shares to the World Bank. So it really is not just an entity on its own, but you are looking at a number of countries. But I also think, Katleko, because of where we are in history now, you are likely to see a scramble for the BRICS, whether we're talking about the new development bank that's owned now by the BRICS or Chinese banks coming in and probably occupying the space that the World Bank has been occupying. And I think that's why, in my assessment, the World Bank is a little bit cautious. I think you're likely to see some of this as crumbling because of the geopolitical context in our time now, where you have almost two countries competing for hegemony. That would be China, of course, and the U.S.
And speaking of those options that Uganda could possibly have, I mean, the president also speaks of tapping into other sources, such as oil production. Do you think this will be viable, or do you still think they would lean more towards what you're mentioning in terms of Russia and China being a second option?
So interestingly, with the oil reserves, they found out that there is about 0.2% reserves of oil, of wild oil reserves in Uganda, and they are going to start expropriating or extracting in 2025. And China is one of the shareholders that has been licensed to do extraction of the oil. France is another country that has also been allowed. And so I think what you might again see, I'm not quite sure how, particularly given that France is part of the G7 and is part of the World Bank, therefore, how this is going to affect the licensing process. I would be keen to see how that unfolds. But this is also to say the fact that China is already on the table, at least through the oil option, I think that might be consequential. But I also need to suggest that Uganda is heavily funded by international development associations outside of, it doesn't really have sufficient budget to run its own affairs. As a matter of fact, now they are really debating now on revising down their national budget just because of the World Bank suspending or threatening to suspend future funding. So the impact is huge, but I would be again keen to see how the geopolitics play out, and I think you're expected to see some surprises as far as Russia and China are concerned.
So, Doc, where do leaders draw the line with regards to preserving the sovereignty of their nations versus feeding people that are really dependent on such funding?
You know, when you're dealing with countries that are, and Uganda, as much as there's been a lot of progress made, but it's not always a solid democracy. And I think the difficult with development economics always has been how you manage politics externally, but at the same time ensuring that the people themselves don't suffer. So on one side, you have the World Bank that has, of course, been doing great work on the ground, working with local government and so on. And then you have a regime that might not be democratic. The regime itself might not be very concerned with the citizens. And I think you've seen that with Russia and other regimes that are not, the interest really is more on maintaining and managing their political sustainability and not necessarily ordinary citizens. And I think from a development point of view, that has been an issue of contest going all the way back to the 1960s on how you really negotiate between ensuring that citizens and the poor do not really suffer in the theater of political play that we are seeing on current global platforms.
I mean, Prof, Doc, earlier on you alluded to the fact that this comes from a conversation that is brewing continentally with regards to that shift from the West towards the East. Do you think this is a time for other countries on the continent to sort of give pushback to the West, to the World Bank, with regards to what their demands are in a way that they're able to shift more towards what suits them?
I think the train has already left the station, so to speak, because if you look at the voices emerging from the BRICS countries themselves, and as a matter of fact, I know there's a BRICS summit that is organized in the next few days that is coming up. You have seen a number of countries from global south, including the oil-producing countries, which are very consequential for the global economy, vying to or applying to join BRICS. That is hugely threat. It's a huge threat to the West at the moment. And with the World Bank, unfortunately, it's what economically we refer to as a neoliberal orthodoxy. What they have tended to do is to condition their financing and undermine what other countries, or not just undermine, but also place conditions on the funding that they give concerning countries' democratic practice. And I think that has not been very well received. It's just that there were not a lot of options. But from 2011, when China really rose to power, overtaking the U.S. as the world's largest trader, so you are seeing that shift and a bold move to align with China. And as a matter of fact, Kafeko, you might have seen African countries voted, most of them, when Russia was being voted out of or countries were voting against Russia, most of the African countries abstained. And abstaining really is aligning with Russia. That is groundbreaking. It's not something that happened historically, but you have seen consistently a pushback against the West. And of course, even much more explicitly, countries saying that they want to find alternatives to the Western organizations, the World Bank, the US, the IMF, and others. You've seen that pushback very explicitly.
Well, it seems there's more pushback that we could expect from many of the countries on the African continent. Thank you so much for your time this evening. That was Dr. Jason Musyoka, a development economist and associate researcher from the University of Pretoria.